So your website bio reads Hong Kong by blood, Manchester by birth. Can we add American by design and Vietnamese by spirit to this list?
That's a very poetic way of. I love that actually.
Great. So there's a lot of world flavors in this film. So I had the chance to look back into your filmography. There's some early shorts. There's a buffet of commercial work, music video work. Essentially, you're developing your skill set as a filmmaker. But I was wondering if working in commercial worlds and video work allows you a space to feel as if you're fully immersed and creative, as is the case with your short films or the feature film. What are those worlds look like separately?
Yeah, no, I think more so in the music video world than the commercial world. It's what I found was a great arena to just constantly cultivate your visual language, your storytelling. I really focused on, from the beginning, I tried to focus on narrative music videos, essentially using the short films. The conflict at the time was there was a trend that was starting to happen as I was getting into the music video career, where idea-based, high-concept music videos were kind of leading the charge. But I managed to still carve out, I stayed true to holding for narrative work, and essentially I was writing short stories every week. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, but you get a lot of briefs and tracks through weekly. So you're just churning them out, and you're trying to think about new ideas, what might resonate with the artist, what story could you tell based off their own personal identity at the time. And as you know, artists with each album, they shed skin and rebuild a new one. So that's really interesting. So yeah, the frequency of it I found really helped so much in being able to always push, cultivate, and experiment, and even. You think about the 3-minute, 5-minute format, and how in the beginning, you understand that if you try and keep something linear, if you try and keep something intimate in that sense, it just feels small. And I was always interested in how to push the contrast of what images you can put together, what vignettes, to make it feel more expansive. And that was something that I constantly was curious about.
Yeah, it's I would say almost the majority of your work is like pre-Lemonade days. So there was like this, like you said, this onset of more larger creative narrative ideas where artists, you're an artist merging with another artist, and that sort of, I love that parallel. I love people that sort of like immerse themselves in that before touching or going into feature filmmaking. I went into the Accidental Getaway Driver knowing absolutely nothing about the premise. And I was surprised to learn that it's based on a true story, that it's informed by potentially a GQ article that you might have touched upon. So how did that tug at your heart, or how did that embed itself into you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And actually what you just said is that was one of the fascinating points, that it feels like it's worlds away.
Yeah.
And even for the viewer, it might feel like it's worlds away. But, the core melody that exists within it is the humanity of the characters. And, that word and that terminology that people use is universal themes, which makes it sound accessible, but in one sense. But, it is, but I don't think in the sense that people use that term. It's like you strip away the veneer of, and I'm not just even talking about this film in general, but you strip away the veneer of your perception of people, strangers, and you understand that like people are surprised that they can connect with another person, and that's interesting because it seems so obvious, but social construct dictates that you see someone who doesn't look like you, see a certain age that doesn't look like you, and yet. And you have this barrier, this initial barrier, this preconception, but underneath it all is that's the beauty of it, And so for me, it was very easy. My manager Jairo Alvarado sent me this article in October 2020, and I was working on some other projects at the time. I was writing something, and he said, "Listen, just take some time, set aside in your day, and just read this, because there's themes in here that you would gravitate towards." And it was very quick to see that you get past the title, you get past the premise, and suddenly there is such a tender and fragile story of four people who each in their own way are all misrepresented or misperceived, or in daily life, in real life, and you just see these fragments of each different person all sharing the same goal or same search for belonging and longing, and you mentioned something before we started this interview of the idea of something that you hold that can carry you through. They're all on these false grounds. For the three quote unquote fugitives, to me there was an opportunity to explore the idea of misrepresentation of incarcerated people, and the idea that people aren't shaped in a vacuum, and media representation kind of creates that sense, but not to justify actions, but there was desperate actions because perhaps there was a desperation to live in a place. You mentioned idea, for a lot of immigrants or POC or the underclass, the underserved, there isn't something that's afforded to them that's so readily afforded to other people, more privileged members of society. And so again, that idea of what you think is offered to you can be shattered, and what happens when something like that shatters, mentally it can affect you deeply.
I like the creative space that you use in two shots. There's one specific sequence where I'll call them father and son for the purposes of this interview. Father and son are at a hotel fence overlooking a pool, and I notice in that instant that there's your choice in the frame subverts this idea that there's you essentially take the space that's between them away from them, and as a viewer you sort of forget that there's that space. And you do this, I don't want to say at a high frequency, but there's at least 3-4 instances where the viewer forgets that there's a space between the characters, that there's a conflict between the characters, that they're a lot closer. And I thought that was such a great physical shot. And I also like the idea that in those instances, you don't villainize your character set. You give them an empathetic view and humanity. How early were you thinking about framing in those circumstances?
It's interesting. I mean, so the insight that you had and the observations of that scene, I really appreciate. It's an understated moment that carries all these layers that you mentioned. Visual language, as we've mentioned before, is something that's kind of gone hand in hand with, even from the first short film or the first short films that I've wrote and directed, or 13 years ago, and through music videos. But it stems from the influences that I have, which in cinema, which was predominantly East Asian cinema, whether that was Edward Yang, Taiwanese New Cinema, Hao Xiaoshen, Tsai Ming-liang, Hong Kong New Wave, obviously, An Hui, Wong Kar-wai, and then also growing up in the UK, I was drawn so much to British kitchen sink realism. And there's these parallels that all of them have of the tempo of ordinary life, beautifying the ordinary, but also in each, and I'll start with kitchen sink realism. For that movement of cinema, it championed the working class, and in a similar parallel to this film, it's a misunderstood class of society where you have one perception and you limit them. But those films just champion the imagination and the depth of the characters. I mean,
Ken Loach is still going back to the same subject matter every single time, and it's always a fresh perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And so there was that beauty is something that constantly just nurtured my own interests, and that's on the thematic side. But then on the visual side, they all shared a relationship with each other, this stillness, the yearn for composition, because we're framing a world in a way that asks you to be an observer rather than being more subjective, and or not manipulative, but maybe more what's the word I'm looking for, contrived in some way. So framing is very important to me, and working closely with my cinematographer on this, who I've worked with for the past 4 years, there's already an unspoken shorthand and relationship in what we're trying to do, and you know, the way that he lights as well is such a beautiful. It feels like it emanates from the soul, rather than, you know, creating these technically beautiful setups that like light from the outside in. You know, these characters are our candles in some way.
Yeah.
So it was really important from the very beginning, and obviously I come from music videos. It's a very heavily visual background. So to me, it goes hand in hand immediately. I think of images as well as story. And I actually wrote very early on that I wanted the world to feel like we constrict these characters in confined spaces, in confined frames. And so when we're in the interiors, they should feel larger than the room almost allows them to be. But when we move into the exteriors, as their resources dry or they become more vulnerable, they become smaller in the expanse.
Yes.
And you know, to your point on defense scene, that's a moment. You know, these two shots, those wides, they exist first to show the vulnerability of these characters because they feel quite small in that space. But then as that conversation, as the bond continues, and one of the details within that is that they share a cigarette. And so I remember speaking to Dustin and Hip during this moment. I was saying, you know, like the cigarette you share is more than just two guys passing time, and it's the last cigarette. It's the last piece of luxurious resource they have, but it's you guys dancing with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, they have their conversation, you reminisce, and like you said, you forget that the conflict that exists between them until there's a moment where Long asks, hey, something, and that cigarette goes out, and we cut back to the wide. And again, you know, it's now the wide is showing the disconnect between them, you know. So I'm glad you pick up on those.
But what's fun is it's a prolonged dance.
Yes.
And it starts in a very tight space. And what I also I like. So I did quick research on your aesthetic world, and it very much belongs to like some commercial work that you did. Like it's a very nocturnal space. Like I just wanted to lazily claim that this is a Michael Mann film, but it goes into a territory that's very Lee Chang-dong to me.
Right.
And so I thought that was such a really interesting choice in your visual vocabulary to create that intimacy, but also then show the expansive world behind them, and that we are living in a world of conflict, and each one is so well constructed and well served. Sorry, I'm rambling on here.
No, I actually wanted to add something to what you're saying because it's really interesting and really insightful. You know, like you said, I think for an American audience, there's a point of reference that was so attuned to, which might be you see a car, you see the title, you see neo-noir LA,
yes.
You think Michael Mann,
yes.
Collateral. But you just mentioned Burning,
yeah.
for example. And I mean, I don't know Lee Chang-dong personally, but when I look at his films, I see that maybe we came from the same source of inspiration, which is the films that I mentioned before, which also goes to show that, I mean, for me as well, in this film, I was actively looking for not just the characters that find themselves marginalized in a Western society trying to figure out if they should assimilate or they should bring their cultures together, but in the language of cinema,
mm-hmm.
it's how do I reconcile my upbringing, my international East Asian influence into a quote-unquote American story, and then how do others, where do their frame of reference come from, and can they reconcile that, or are they trying to make the film assimilate into their culture too? So that's a challenge that I welcome for viewers, you know.
I'd like to talk about the use of humor, and there's one long sequence where the characters are playing with one food element, and I found so much joy into what I felt was potentially an improvised moment. How was it filming that sequence? I imagine you might have spent more than one day in that hotel room, but it's such an interesting addition to all these turns in the film. So I want to get your thinking into the creation of that moment, but also the importance of embedding a tone that's a bit lighter, because you are working with so much damaged souls and larger ideas that would normally weight the film down and not allow for those things to transpire. So yeah, it's a double question thrown at you.
I love it, and I love that you picked that scene out. It's actually my favorite scene within the film. I want to start first with the heaviness, the emotional weight of this film, and the humor just in general, and we'll get to the Sunflower Seed game. It comes from a personal place of hearing my own grandparents and my parents talk about their lives and upbringing, and it wasn't an easy one for any of them. They come from pretty humble backgrounds, and it was very trying. And it's funny because, if you tell that story, you hear those moments, as I recall, there's such heavy heartbreak and sadness in them. But there was always, especially my father and my mother too, but my father had so much humor in these really incidental minutes and moments in his life. And I think, as I got older, I think about the trials and tribulations that most people go through, but yet they stand here in the present, and the only way you get through that is the lightheartedness, to the humor that can get you through. And that's something I whether or not I consciously or subconsciously thought about when I was young, but it's something that I naturally tried to weave through this film, and it's not something that I was like, okay, there has to be humor. It's just, I just found myself as I was writing this, just like, oh, here's a moment, especially with Eddie. Eddie brings levity, and it wasn't to actively make him the character that does so, but I think there's a youthfulness or a naivety to him against the cynicism of the others that kind of can create those quiet moments. And the Sunflower Seed game is interesting. I'm glad it feels improvised, because it was something that I constructed early on. I knew that there was this moment, and for me, actually, I'm sure you're aware, Takeshi Kitano, his films, brilliant off-kilter, quiet comedy, subversive for the Yakuza genre. They're not really about that, are they? They're about these strained or broken or quirky characters that exist within the parameters of that. And there's this film Sonatine that I love so much, and there's that scene, if you remember, there's that scene where the two of the men are playing on the beach with a pistol. Yeah. And Beat Takeshi comes down and he plays a game with them, Russian roulette, but they don't realize he's taking all the bullets out. For that was a more suspenseful scene, but it happened in a moment in the film where it was just, you learn so much about these characters without having to say anything at all. And for me, there was this moment in the film where, you needed, chaos comes with Aden, one of the characters, and in his absence, what happens when he leaves? And I don't know, there's a stillness and light that could happen with the 3 generations of Vietnamese men. And I, again, what I look for is those inconsequential minutes. It's not, I'd like the characters, or it to feel like the characters lead the viewer through their world, rather than we ask the plot to drag the characters through the world. And so in this space, what would 3 men do to pass time? It would be to make something, to play a game, and you forget in these moments, you get carried away in competition, or in just there's an interesting idea that it's Sunflower Seed game, but you can imagine each one of them playing a different version of this game. Not with a cup and not with a seed, it could be anything, and so they're passing time, and in that passing of time you form this family, and you see them, and there was an intention to kind of, I'm sure you remember the moment, Eddie's sat on a chair on the left side of frame, and the 2 men, Longma and Thea, sat on the bed, and then I hold the camera there, and we just move as they unite, and this corner of the wall disappears, and now it's 3 of them on the bed together. The bit that I enjoyed so much was I think I spoke to Dustin about this. He was like, I'm not sure where this is going, but I'll just get lost in it. And the improvised part is just letting them be 3 people. I remember running that scene for 10 minutes because I was enjoying just watching. I got lost watching them. It made me think about so many people that I know, or my family, or just what we do in these minutes as we're waiting for something, and we get lost in a moment. It's something so simple. Yeah.
I'd love to talk about an actor in your film. He's the protagonist. He has a relatively young career. I was just looking at his IMDb page, but I could just imagine him receiving the screenplay. I imagine you audition a lot of people. And when I saw the GQ article, I saw there was a visual reference And I said, my God, it's a spitting image of the character that you ended up, the actor that you ended up casting. I just wanted to get a sense of, were you aware that, I mean, his agent probably sent him the script? Like what was it for him at this stage of his life as a human being? Forget about a professional actor, but like, what did this give him as a person? Like, did you get a sense of how meaningful or impactful this might be for him to take a lead, minimal dialogue, but like totally own the film?
It's interesting. I think it also, there's a generational difference. Even like, obviously, you know, it's commented on in the film, but in real life too. Hip, you know, we rarely have long conversations with each other, and whether that's because of language or that he's somebody who doesn't often, you know, of a certain generation, don't often share profusely how you feel. So we never really talk too in depth, but his actions, just like it is in the film, like his actions showed me how much it means. How tactile he was, and the embraces that he gave me, you know, showed me how much this means. And like you said, you don't get many opportunities to be in something like this at a certain age, of a certain culture, let alone, you know, there's so many components that do so. But to me, like, what he imbued in this was, you immediately feel the sentimentality and the softness of someone like him, the actor, and the grateful, like the gratitude to throw everything into it. And I think that's really an extension of the character itself. You know, again, we might perceive one thing. Like, if you ever met him, I'm sure he wouldn't, you know, even if you spoke French or Vietnamese, I don't think he would share too much of how he felt. But you would see it in his face, and you would see it in the way his actions are with you. You know, I think it was deeply important to him for us to be able to hold a mirror up to a lost generation. And that being present in there was more than everything, you know, he needed to articulate.
Without giving away too much information about the final sequence, actually, I don't want to give much away at all. But I love that there's a simplicity with this. I want to call it a still shot. We are introduced to the surroundings of this apartment, but I just love the final note. And I imagine that might be a wink to other filmmaking masters, but I was wondering if you could talk about that choice without giving away anything about the plot or where the film rests, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You stop me if I'm starting to overshare.
Okay.
But there's an intention from the beginning, and of knowing. And it's funny, actually, you know,
because it says a lot about the character that we've been following all this time, and that we have relatively no information on.
Yeah.
And it allows us to breathe more. It's more insight into his world, but it's such a poignant, touching note.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the old masters. This wasn't something like the language of cinema, but I remember when I was very young, I remember reading a quote from Billy Wilder saying, you know, if you don't know what your third act is, you know, you should know what your third act is before you even start with the first act. And it's like the bookend of the film. It was immediate in terms of the opening shot after the prologue. The opening shot of that we introduce Longmire in his apartment is enveloped by shadows, and it's night. And the final shot of the film is the same room, but bathed in afternoon light with the door open. And this quiet idea that the world around Longmire never changed, but he did in some way. And you know, so his world now is bathed in a light that wasn't present in the beginning. And so he steps out, and the stillness, you know, to this, the humanity of the conversation that he has in the absence of physically seeing the other person. You know, I was thinking a lot about it. Actually, maybe someone asked me a question about it at the library where you were at, about this ending. And I thought a little more about it, and I was thinking, you know, in some ways it feels quite sweet, but in other ways it's so melancholic. But ultimately, you know, I'm gonna just give something away, and maybe you'll, you know, it's like both characters became vulnerable enough to understand that they were deserving of love and to be with each other. At the same time, knowing that they're going to lose one another again, whether that's unsure of how the indefinite nature of how he's going to remain in prison, or Long Ma in the eve of his life. But actually, to me, you know, and he steps out, and you leave wondering about it. But I actually think it shows even more strength that after all they've gone through and how much they've shielded themselves from ever like extending a hand out again, that they were brave enough to know that there's an expiration date potentially on it, but they will go again. They will connect with people again. So that was a really important, quiet sentiment that I wanted to imbue with it. In the stillness, and you hear the warmth of the chatter, you know, of the people outside.
It's so poignant. It really is a beautiful final touch. And again, like, I love all the turns, the choices that you make in the screenplay, but just how we move along their different narratives, their different plights, their different future outcomes. It's a totally believable world. I'll end with this question: is I don't necessarily want to know what your next project might be, but what are, like, you know, you're a world citizen, you go a little bit everywhere, you do have a lot of stories in your desk or your desktop. What are some themes or larger ideas that concern you right now as a world citizen, or that you would like to explore, or any even visual ideas?
The impermanence, the natural impermanence of time or connection between people, and even if it might be intrinsic to those two, but like the lasting effects of what that might be, you know, that goes beyond just two people. You know, what is that influence, whether it's incidental or direct, and you know, it goes back to the very first thing we talked about, human connection, and the perceived idea that we can be surprised, that we can connect so fervently with a stranger from somewhere else in the world, and yet there's always a commonality. Like, those are the two, whatever the form they may take, whatever vessel they might exist in, you know, what kind of story, I think that would be the through line.
Well, you made us walk a mile in 4 different sets of shoes, and even the characters that might have less screen time, they're totally believable and palpable, and I'm just looking forward to what you're gonna end up doing next. So thank you for this film. Congratulations on this film. And continued success, and enjoy the film festival circuit.
Thank you so much.
Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.